Hi, I'm Kristen Goodwin. On this episode of the Fox News Rundown, the timing of the Senate's impeachment trial against President Trump remains unclear. But could it end up overshadowing President-elect Joe Biden's inauguration day? Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace weighs in on impeachment, the breach on Capitol Hill, and tech companies banning President Trump. And with the 59th inauguration inching closer, the Secret Service and federal law enforcement agencies are beefing up security to prevent any further violence. Former CIA station chief and Fox News contributor Dan Hoffman discusses these scaled-up safety measures and the threat of domestic terrorism. Plus commentary from former Utah congressman and Fox News contributor Jason Chaffetz. The Fox News Rundown is a daily news podcast where we take a deeper look at the stories important to you. You can subscribe on your favorite podcast player by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
I'm Ainsley Earhart.
I'm Brett Baer.
I'm Katie Pavlich, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, January 15th, 2021. I'm Chris Foster. President Trump, after losing the election and now after impeachment, still has a lot of supporters. The riot at the Capitol has a lot of people turning their backs.
The biggest punishment that the president got this week, it wasn't the impeachment, it was the PGA announcing that they are pulling the major tournament, the PGA, which is, the Professional Golf Association Championship, from his golf course in Bedminster, New Jersey in 2022.
We speak with Fox News Sunday host Chris Wallace.
I'm Lisa Brady. Much of downtown D.C. is already sealed off in preparation for next week's inauguration, an earlier and stronger security presence.
One lesson we learned from January 6th, from those riots that breached the Capitol, is we didn't have enough state, federal, local law enforcement and military there to protect our lawmakers.
And I'm Jason Chaffetz. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
It's the end of President Trump's last full week in office, a term he'll be allowed to complete with any Senate impeachment trial waiting until after Joe Biden is sworn in to replace him at noon next Wednesday. That could at least partially overshadow President Biden's agenda out of the gate. President Trump, meantime, ends his time in office without the social media he used so prodigiously, having been blocked by all the major services.
These are tense and difficult times. The efforts to censor, cancel, and blacklist our fellow citizens are wrong, and they are dangerous.
But the president, as we heard in that video he released Wednesday, can still use the power of the office to get out any message he wants. And right now, his message is one of unity.
I'm calling on all Americans to overcome the passions of the moment and join together as one American people.
He says now let's try to find common ground and shared purpose.
He put out this video on Wednesday, and mob violence, and we're against any of that, and our supporters and our movement is all for law and order.
Chris Wallace is the host of Fox News Sunday.
I would have been a lot more impressed if he had released that video around 2 o'clock on Wednesday, January 6th, not 6 o'clock on Wednesday, January 13th. I remember as a kid, my mother saying, sometimes sorry doesn't cut it. And sorry a week after the fact, I'm not impressed by it, but, I'm sure others are.
Well, if he'd put on that video on January 6th at 2 p.m., he might not have gotten himself impeached.
Oh, I think that there's absolutely, on the 6th, I'm not sure. It might have been too late. If he'd put it out on the 5th, and maybe not even held the rally in the first place. I mean, you do have to ask yourself, what is the president doing? It's January 6th. He's put out tweets saying, come show up on the 6th. It's going to be a wild one. This is the day we fight for the election. And then you hold this rally with tens of thousands of people and call out Mike Pence and say, I hope he's going to do the right thing. And you say, I'm never going to accept the election. We're never going to concede. And let's all walk down to the Capitol. Now, did he say break the windows? Did he say chant hang Mike Pence? Did he say bring handcuffs and ask where's Nancy and endanger the lives of our elected representatives? No, but boy, look, I'm not some wild-eyed liberal outside in this particular case with Liz Cheney and Mitch McConnell, who basically said that he stacked the firewood and he lit the flame.
There were Republicans at the impeachment debate saying that, look, this is just going to make things worse, we should move on. And there are still Republicans saying, look, there was fraud in the election. Where at the same time, those 10 Democrats and those 10 Republicans, and the Democrats say that no, he needs to be punished for ginning up his base like this and for these false election claims, not just that day, but in the weeks and months prior.
Yeah. Look, do I think that it's the best thing for the country to have a Senate trial on Inauguration Day or the first full day, the 21st of the Biden administration? Probably not. And, we do have more urgent and pressing matters, particularly after the president has left office, like confirming a government. We haven't had a single hearing yet on a Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Treasury, all those things. And he's got an emergency COVID relief package to deal both with vaccinations and with economic relief. I do think Congress needs to be going full speed ahead on that. I don't know. I honestly am mixed on the trial, because I do think that the president's involvement in all of this was extraordinary and deeply damaging to the country, and I'm not sure it doesn't need to be adjudicated. And maybe the answer is just impeachment, because, it sends a bad message. I understand why Democrats might want it, to have the trial, first, to punish the president, and two, if he gets off, that, then they have put some Republicans in tough spots when they're up for re-election in 2022 and 4. But on the other hand, it does divide the country. I'd like to think I have pretty strong opinions or analysis about most things. This one I'm not sure about. Two impeachment. Listen, what the biggest punishment that the president got this week? It wasn't the impeachment. It was the PGA announcing that they are pulling the major tournament, the PGA, which is, the Professional Golf Association Championship, from his golf course in Bedminster, New Jersey in 2022. I promise you that hurt him more than the second impeachment.
Well, the word I read from somebody from a source was that he was, quote, gutted by that decision. I mean, he's financially and to an extent politically, other than his supporters, he's a man without a country now. And legally, he's in real jeopardy. Whether he pardons himself, and there's some question whether that would stand or not, but it certainly doesn't stand for state prosecutions. And we know that the New York Attorney General, the New York City District Attorney are all looking at issues financially. He, if you believe the New York Times story, owes hundreds of millions of dollars, rather. And there's a lot of liability, in addition to which, I mean, I got to think, if you're one of the Trump kids, you're thinking to yourself, and not to say that they weren't participants in all of this themselves, but, is it going to be harder to get people an event at a Trump golf course or at a Trump hotel? Is it going to be harder to get people to live in a Trump-branded apartment building, luxury apartment building? I think he's in for some tough times, which may be one of the reasons he fought so hard to hold on to power. For all this talk of asking President Biden to ask that, look, let's just all move on, his supporters might feel betrayed by that. I mean, there were people who wanted President Obama to punish members of the Bush administration for some things they did, and he just moved on. What do you think Joe Biden will do?
I don't know. He hasn't wanted to be part of this fight. He's really stayed out of it and said that's up for Congress to decide. Again, I think he knows that his mark as president is not going to be made by what happens to Donald Trump. It's going to be made by what happens on the public health crisis we're facing now, the economic crisis we're facing now, and his very ambitious agenda that he's pushing right now. So, I don't know what he's going to do. I'll tell you what he isn't going to do. We always have that grace note at the beginning of an inaugural address where the new president says, and I don't honestly remember what Trump did with Obama in 2017, but I know what Obama did with Bush in 2009 or Bush with Clinton in 2001. Where they, thank the president and praise him, even if it's a little hard to do, for what he did and his stewardship of the country over the past 4 or 8 years. I don't think you're going to hear that from Joe Biden.
Looking at the attack investigation, just talking about the riot at the Capitol for one more time, Have you spoken with anyone about claims that the rioters had help? Do you think this is going to be a huge, huge scandal?
The answer is I don't know. I have spoken. I did last week. I interviewed this last Sunday. I interviewed Jim Clyburn, the number 3 Democrat in the House Majority Whip, and he told me a very chilling story. He said that he had an office right off the road, the Statuary Hall on the main floor of the Capitol, and it says Majority Whip and James Clyburn on it. And he said during the riot that office was never touched. And he said, meanwhile, he's got kind of a hideaway where his staff works and he works much more than in the ceremonial office up on the 3rd floor, that people don't even kind of know exists. And he said there were rioters banging on that door. So he says, I'm not going to charge it, but he said, I certainly wonder whether they had inside help as to where I might really be and where my staff might really be. And of course, you heard that on the floor of the House this week, with people talking about, members of Republicans holding tours the day before. Were they giving tours to people who ended up participating in the riots? This is where things are. There's questions about Capitol Hill police. That's one of the really disturbing things of this whole thing. There were people there who were armed, outfitted, and seemed prepared with tactical expertise, whether they were current or former police officers, current or former military. There were some people who had training that helped them in carrying out this riot. I mean, the bottom line here, Chris, is we are so lucky that it wasn't so much worse. They came so close. You look at the timeline, they came so close to getting their hands on members of the Senate, the Vice President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, members of the House. Think what happens then if it's a hostage situation. And, there's talk that some of them wanted to put Mike Pence, the vice president, on trial, saying that, he was stealing the election from Donald Trump. It was horrible, unforgettable. I certainly never experienced anything in my life, but it could have been even worse.
Yeah. President Trump can still send out press. He's going out more quietly than he's conducted himself with no social media now. He can still send out press releases and videos through the White House. He's still obviously got a huge platform. He and his supporters say that this is censorship. The people running the services say no, it's about preventing more violence. Have you put a lot of thought into it?
Yeah, I have mixed feelings. I'm obviously I'm a free speech person. This isn't a First Amendment issue because that says government shall make no law, and Twitter and Facebook and Google, they're not government. They're private companies, and they have leeway to do things that are not in contravention of the First Amendment. I'm a free speech guy, and I'm generally very much in favor of that. But free speech does have limits. The one that we always talk about is you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. Public safety is a limit on free speech, and you can certainly understand how companies would feel that after the events of last Wednesday, that it's dangerous to have those voices on their platforms. Now, having said that, it's a slippery slope because, there's a lot of junk on Twitter and other places, and you've got the Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran and other bloodthirsty people have Twitter platforms. So, how do you draw the line? But I can't condemn Twitter after last Wednesday for reacting and saying, we need to be careful that we're not doing anything to enable an insurrection.
A lot of measured opinions out of you this week, Chris Wallace.
I like to think there are always measured opinions with us.
Chris Wallace, host of Fox News Sunday. Thanks a lot. Hey, I'll talk to you during the Biden administration.
Yes, I'll talk to you. As we always say, I think it's very clever. I'll talk to you next year. Talk to you in the next president.
This is Jason Chaffetz with your Fox News commentary coming up.
The nation's capital is looking more and more like an encampment, teeming with troops ahead of next week's inauguration as the investigation continues into last week's deadly security breach.
As the president made clear yesterday, we are committed to an orderly transition and to a safe inauguration. And the American people deserve nothing less.
Vice President Mike Pence receiving a security briefing at FEMA headquarters Thursday from several agencies, including the FBI.
Our posture is aggressive. It's going to stay that way through the inauguration.
FBI Director Christopher Wray says they've arrested more than 100 people over last week's violent siege, and they've identified dozens more, with agents hunting them down across the country. But there are more potential threats, including calls for armed protest.
We are seeing an extensive amount of concerning online chatter, I think it's the best way I would describe it, about a number of events surrounding the inauguration. And together with our partners, we evaluate those threats and what kind of resources to deploy against them.
The Secret Service director says inaugural planning had already been underway for months, and they're highly confident in that plan, but always wide-eyed and sober. The reinforcements ordered after the deadly Capitol attack could total more than 20,000 National Guard troops and thousands of active duty troops.
First of all, it's a general principle that you really want to present overwhelming force to deter would-be attackers from launching against you.
Dan Hoffman is a former CIA station chief and a Fox News contributor.
If you're trying to protect an installation and you have too much defense, too many troops, that's okay. You know, if after the inauguration we look back and say, well, we had 20,000 National Guard, but we only needed 10, that's all right. One lesson we learned from January 6th, from those riots that breached the Capitol, is we didn't have enough state, federal, and local law enforcement and military there to protect our lawmakers. And there's an unknown out there right now. We know that certain installations are under threat, but there could be additional violence that we need to be prepared for, and I think that's why we want to have as much force as we can.
I know the FBI has said after the attack that it did warn law enforcement about possible plans for violence at the Capitol. But when investigators are tracking groups online, for instance, how difficult is it to distinguish between just talk and actual planning, and at what point can law enforcement act on that?
Well, that's, the challenge certainly that the FBI faces, but they do this on a very regular basis, certainly when it comes to domestic or foreign terrorists in our country. The FBI collects lots of intelligence from sources in their networks. They scrape the social media network sites. They put all that information together and produce essentially all source analysis so that state, federal, local law enforcement can make good decisions about where the threats are and seek to eliminate those threats before they materialize. That was the failure on January 6th. Reportedly, there were no analytical reports received from DHS or from FBI, and some of the state, local law enforcement, the Capitol Police, felt like they didn't know enough about the threat beforehand. Now, I think they could have been asking for these sorts of reports because it was pretty well known that there was going to be a large gathering of people in the nation's capital, and that was certainly well known, and there was lots of reporting on it. But certainly, I think your point is right. The collecting the information, analyzing it right so that you can put it to use is of critical value.
We've heard the term domestic terrorists used often lately to describe the Capitol rioters. Is that a legal term, and what does it actually mean?
So it's a term that's, commonly used, obviously, for foreign non-state actors. And the use, terrorism, the definition of it's an unlawful use of violence or intimidation against civilians to pursue political aims. And so when we talk about domestic terrorism, that's what, you could apply that to. If you think that a group of violent extremists are perpetrating violent acts against civilians to pursue political aims, then a lawyer might argue that they are guilty of domestic terrorism.
I know with the international terrorism component in particular, we started to hear a lot over the years about the risk of lone wolf attacks. Is there also a risk of that with domestic terrorism? Because, there's concerns about extremists either from the far left or the far right And if they don't have a centralized target, let's say, if we go around and sort of harden all the obvious, public targets, would there be more of a concern then of them trying to stage more individualized attacks? Is that something that the intelligence community looks at regularly?
Yeah, so I have a couple of concerns certainly about lone wolf attacks. First of all, when our focus is on these large gatherings of individuals seeking to attack a particular installation, sometimes that's precisely when a foreign or domestic terrorist, be it a lone wolf terrorist, might seek to strike, when our resources are stretched. And that can present a great challenge to us. And the second point I would make is look back at the recent attack in Nashville. That was one person who caused extraordinary disrupted cell phone activity, disrupted 9/11 service. Imagine if there were attacks that were combined in such a way that first responders were unable to communicate and there were violent acts that were being perpetrated. And if foreign terrorists know that 16 to 20 January is precisely when we are at the greatest risk of domestic unrest, they may seek to take advantage by targeting our infrastructure, communications, and other things. So this is a particularly, dangerous time. It's when our law enforcement at the federal, local, and state level, they are on the hook to do the hard work. Now, again, they've been doing this for 20 years, and they do a great job of it. But make no mistake, it's extraordinarily challenging, and it's an all-hands-on-deck kind of scenario.
We certainly did have a major security shift in the U.S., really and around the world, after 9/11 happened. Will the threats of today lead to another intense shift in how we secure the U.S.? I mean, I guess the security landscape is always kind of evolving, but what kind of changes could you see happening now?
I think, we do a great job overall. I think where we failed on January 6th, it doesn't necessarily require that we do anything different. It's that we need to be doing the things that we have done up to this point successfully. So there was plenty of intelligence, plenty of information scraped from social media and networking sites. We knew where there were large numbers of people coming to Washington, D.C. to protest. And it would have been easy enough to find out who they are and to know the risks that they posed to the Capitol. And we failed to put helicopters overhead to track them. We failed to have the overwhelming force at the Capitol that would have deterred them or prevented them from breaching the Capitol. So those were all failures. But we kind of knew that beforehand. And so I think we'll go back over this. There'll be accountability. There will be lessons learned. Those lessons will be internalized, and we'll go forward and do better. Frankly, I believe we're fortunate that January 6th didn't turn out to be worse than it was.
In the immediate aftermath of the Capitol attack, there were the resignations of the House and Senate sergeants at arms and also the Capitol police chief. Is that fair? I mean, should they have maybe waited for the investigation to really get going, or were those important steps just to, kind of show some early accountability, if you will?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a great point that you make, because I didn't feel like they should have been so quick to resign. I think they should stay and assist with the accountability. They're gone now, and maybe they would have been fired, who knows, but they should have stuck around and helped those who were staying understand where things went wrong. And so I think they did those decisions that they made to resign. I think those were precipitous decisions, and they shouldn't have. I think the accountability is all about looking at what went wrong, and we still are in, kind of incident response, collecting the facts on what went wrong. We need to do it quickly, but we certainly haven't finished collecting all those facts and learning all those lessons. Hopefully we've learned enough to protect ourselves in the coming days.
Dan, I know you have a wide-ranging background, not only with the CIA, but the military, the State Department. What advice would you give to the incoming administration at this point?
As far as domestic terrorism is concerned?
Sure. Domestic terrorism, security in general, the U.S. security posture.
That, what I've learned over the years is this. there are three stages of intelligence, essentially. The first is collecting the information. And that can be, online. It could be through human sources, but it's collecting raw data. The second stage is analyzing that data. So taking everything you know, including, open source information, whatever you've got, and then doing what we call all source analysis. And then the third stage is making good decisions based on the analysis. If you do all those three things, if you collect information and you analyze it properly, and you make an informed executive decision that's the right one, you've got an intelligence success. If you fail at any one of those stages, you've got a failure. And of course, we saw that on January 6th. That, I think, applies to national security. That is what national security is all about. It's why that I was so honored to serve at CIA for so many years, because we were on that, out there on the front lines, recruiting spies and stealing secrets. I know my old boss, John Brennan, didn't like to call it that, but that's what it was. And that's what matters for our national security. And our executive decision makers, starting with President-elect Biden, need to demand the best intelligence we've got, the best analysis we've got, so that he and his team can make the best decisions. If you look at some of the successes of the Trump administration, for example, destroying ISIS, dealing with Iran and successfully targeting the General Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Quds Force, destroying Al-Qaeda leadership, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the leader of that branch of Al-Qaeda, Qasem al-Rimi. All of those successes were intelligence-based. I know Secretary Pompeo over at the State Department, of course, he was director of CIA. He knew how to read the intelligence and use it to produce the best kind of diplomacy that he could. And that's really, I think, critical for this new administration, is to get that right and ensure that there's that flow of information and analysis to the decision makers so they can make, the most educated decisions.
Dan Hoffman, always appreciate your insight. Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. All the best.
From the Fox News Podcasts Network. In these ever-changing times, you can rely on Fox News for hourly updates for the very latest news and information on your time. Listen and download now at foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
And now, some good news with Tanya J. Powers.
In the wake of the riot at the U.S. Capitol, many stories have circulated, and one of them has featured Eugene Goodman. He's the Capitol police officer who kept a group of rioters carrying Confederate flags and weapons away from the Senate chambers. Video shows him holding the group back, then retreating up some stairs in the opposite direction of the chamber entrance, which some police experts say was a tactic to draw the rioters away from the lawmakers, staff members, and reporters inside. Goodman is being held as a hero, with bipartisan accolades from some of those in the House of Representatives. 3 House members, Republican Nancy Mace of South Carolina, Democrat Emanuel Cleaver of Missouri, and Democrat Charlie Crist of Florida, have announced the introduction of a bill to award Officer Goodman with the Congressional Gold Medal for his bravery and quick thinking. Past recipients include Frank Sinatra, Rosa Parks, the Little Rock Nine, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Goodman also served in the Army from 2002 to 2006 and was deployed with the 101st Airborne for a year to Iraq. The 18th Airborne Corps at Fort Bragg recognized Goodman in a tweet, saying he is, quote, rightfully being hailed as a hero after single-handedly holding back rioters from entering the Senate chambers, and goes on to say Eugene was a hero long before January 6th, and that they celebrate his valor. So do we, Officer Goodman. Tanya J. Powers, Fox News.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Jason Chaffetz.
What's on your mind?
Never let it be said that Democrats let crises of the past 12 months go to waste. With the coronavirus pandemic, forced closures of large swaths of the economy and civil unrest, the left did what it always does in times of crisis: leverage disaster for political gain. It worked, so we can expect to see a lot more of it. The left has continued its crusade to suppress conservative views in many forums. Earlier, leftists gutted election security procedures using the pandemic as their justification. Democratic office holders have managed to amplify false narratives and conceal true ones with the help of partners in the left-wing media, powerful social media platforms, the nonprofit sector, and government. There seemed to be no line the Democrats wouldn't cross to capitalize on America's misfortunes. Welcome to disaster liberalism, and buckle up. Now that the success of those efforts has given Democrats bare majorities in the U.S. House and Senate, along with the presidency, as of Wednesday, we can expect them to double down on the tactics that worked so well for them in 2020. Given the choice between moderating their positions to attract more support and claiming a crisis to strip away checks on their power, the Democrats will choose the latter. The crises of the past 12 months provide the pretext by which leftists achieve their goal. Now that Democrats have the power they sought, we can expect them to continue to leverage real crises, exaggerate small ones, and fabricate new ones to justify exponentially bigger power grabs. For the left, crises change, but the solutions are always the same: more government, less freedom, and higher taxes. Unfortunately for Democrats, our recent crises came during a Republican presidency under the stewardship of a man who showed little appetite for leveraging the crises to expand federal power. I shudder to think what this country would look like today had Hillary Clinton held the reins of presidency during the coronavirus pandemic. But even with a Republican president and Senate to check their power, Democrats managed to leverage the crises that have engulfed America in ways that did great damage to our country. Even as President Trump prepares to leave office, we see the strategy playing out. Democrats spent years justifying violence. They told us when we saw violent far-left Occupy and Black Lives Matter protests that this is what democracy looks like. They used Facebook and Twitter to organize large-scale violence. But now the tables have turned. Suddenly, Democrats are no longer claiming that protests are mostly peaceful when some participants turn violent. Now they justify the suppression of an entire political party. Suddenly, social media are a dangerous place to organize, but only for those who oppose Democrats. All others can continue to organize their violent protests unimpeded. We can expect to see much more punitive responses to speech the left labels unpopular. We will see efforts to punish or retaliate against those who would undermine the majority position. No longer will we hear that this is what democracy looks like. For the good of the country, we need to resist efforts to use disasters as a justification for running roughshod over constitutional protections. While Democrats control the federal legislative and executive branches, Republicans hold the majority of state legislatures. We must hold the line on defending and enforcing the checks and balances that protect us from a majority that has clearly signaled its preference for tyranny. I'm Jason Chaffetz, former member of Congress and a Fox News contributor.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com. Did you hear the news? Now you can. With instant updates from Fox News for Amazon Alexa. Just say,
Alexa, play news from Fox.
In Fox News.
It's the latest when you need it, on demand, from Fox News and Amazon Alexa.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.